What's the winning formula for Missouri football this season? And is this finally the season that Dennis Gates has a team that can play some defense? Let's talk about that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And on the hoop side, is this finally going to be the year where Dennis Gates figures out a half-decent defense in his head coaching career? Plus, Eli Drinkwitz, yes, a persona that actually resonates with cool people, believe it or not. But before I start the show, I remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. The terms apply. And I want to think about the winning formula for Missouri in 2024. And specifically, let's compare it to the two best runs of my lifetime with Missouri, certainly in the last 25 years or so in this millennium. Of course, I'm talking about 2013 and 2007. And of course, you could throw in 2014 as well, another SEC championship team, and 2008 as well, another Big 12 North quality type team that had some really high advanced numbers despite, well, ultimately having kind of a disappointing season, at least based on expectations. So how does this 2024 team compare in terms of just the sort of the variables here? Well, first of all, you've got a veteran quarterback with tons of experience in Brady Cook. Of course, that was the same in 2007, 2013 with Chase Daniel and James Franklin as well. You also had an excellent and experienced receiving core, an incredibly deep receiving core, senior, junior, laden, and the guys who weren't all that experienced, like, for example, in 07, Jeremy Macklin and Denario Alexander, ended up being two of the greatest players at the position in school history. Plus, you had Chase Kaufman, Martin Rucker, Tommy Saunders, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the 2013 Tigers, those senior receivers in Marcus Lucas and LaDamian Washington, and the best version of Dorial Green Beckham as well, and also Bud Sasser in the fold as well. Sounds a heck of a lot like what Missouri has this coming season. Theo Weiss, I believe his fifth season of college football. Luther Burden III, thought of as one of the highest ranked players in the NFL draft this coming season. Mookie Cooper, a senior. Mekhi Miller and Daniel Blood looking like really capable possession receivers. And oh yes, of course, one of our favorites, Marquise Speedy Johnson, taking the top off the defense, and a guy who's sure to branch out in his route tree this coming season as well. So you're looking at just a ton of explosive playmakers. And I even bring up Brett Norfleet, who I think a lot of us expect to take a big step in his true sophomore season as well. Then offensively, we're still not even talking about the defense here yet, right? But offensively on the line, frankly, this should be a better Missouri offensive line than 2007. But 2013, that's a pretty high bar to clear for sure, with four guys who played at least a little bit in the NFL, plus Max Copeland, a really strong contributor as well. I think that Missouri offensive line this season will fall somewhere in between those units. So let's talk defensively. 2013 had a really, really good defense that frankly faltered in the SEC championship game against Auburn in 2013. Similarly, 2007's defense was certainly above average as well, but we couldn't stop Oklahoma in two chances down in Norman and, of course, in the SEC championship game as well. Now, for 2024, you got a lot of question marks there. Let's be real. The defensive coordinator is new. New cornerbacks after 2 NFL players are drafted. Defensive line, hey, Darius Robinson, your best edge rusher last season. A first-round type draft pick. I believe he was first round, right? He was right there if not. But regardless, linebackers, Tyron Hopper is gone. Can Chuck Hicks play a big role? What about Corey Flagg, the transfer from Miami? There's some question marks there as well. If Missouri truly has another elite offense this season, what does their defense have to do? That's really the question. Does it have to be as good as last season? Well, it turns out really overall, I think, if you look at all of college football, I think last year was a pretty good gauge for where the Tigers need to finish. Because, of course, last season, if there were a 12-team playoff, like there were this season, well, it looks pretty likely that the Tigers would have made it. At least if you look at S&P Plus, for example, a number that I cite quite a bit from ESPN's premium side of its site. But with the 13th best offense and the 14th best defense, that gives you a pretty good gauge that if Missouri's offense is going to be better than 13th, well, then the defense has a little bit of wiggle room there, but obviously not too much because the Tigers end up finishing 9th, 10th, depending on what advanced metrics you want to look at. But for example, last season, again, looking at these metrics, the Oregon Ducks had the number 1 offense in football nationally statistically, and it was so good that they were number 3 overall in every statistical category despite having the 16th best offense. So again, 1 versus 16th, they end up 3rd overall. That's a pretty good spread. On the other side of things, you look at Missouri's opponent in the Cotton Bowl, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Well, they were only 34th on offense. Hey, there's something the naysayers won't point out, by the way, that the Tigers apparently they were going to go up a juggernaut of an offense before their starting quarterback went out. But I digress there a little bit. Regardless, Ohio State ends up 34th offensively, statistically, and 2nd on defense for 4th overall. So again, you can have a 34th on one side of the ball if you're elite enough on the other. Apparently, you can still be a top 5 quality team. So here's the long story short here, all you true sons and daughters. Missouri needs, I would say, a top 30 type defense this season. I would say at the minimum, if they're going to make the college football playoff. If the offense performs up to, I would say, reasonable expectations, I would say a top 20 defense likely gets it done in terms of Missouri getting into the playoffs. So, again, considering Missouri had a really good defense last season with, I believe, 4 guys getting drafted into the NFL. They were 14th overall last season. We need to get a top 20 this season despite all those losses, despite a new defensive coordinator. Hey, no pressure, Corey Batoon, but we're counting on you, bud. And speaking of defense, well, you know what? Let's transition to basketball for just a second. I do think that this is a critical year for Dennis Gates in many ways, but I, as a basketball fan and, well, maybe a purist to some extent, would like to see something from Dennis Gates defensively this season for, frankly, the first time in his career. As much as I like Dennis Gates, there's not a lot of evidence that he is a great defensive coach this season. So let's talk about what I'd like to see from the Tigers in 2024-25 here in just a little bit. First, though, let's talk about Gametime, because this time of year, yes, Major League Baseball season. Who doesn't like getting out to the ballpark? And, of course, Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, and starting on Friday night, a 2-game series at Kauffman Stadium between the Kansas City Royals and the St. Louis Cardinals. Definitely an important series for both teams at this point, fighting for a wild card spot, possibly even the division as well, though obviously the odds of that are quite a bit longer. But regardless, frankly, I'd love to see a 3-game series, but a 2-game series, we'll take it. And with Gametime, you can always look at your seat views up to the last minute. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On College Football podcast. Spencer McLaughlin gets you ready for an exciting season on the gridiron. We're talking the portal, NIL, expanded playoffs, realignment. If you like my format, you're going to love Locked On College Football, available on YouTube, wherever you get podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And let's talk some basketball here a little bit, because you know what? I'm choosing to be optimistic for this season because, of course, so far 2 years under Dennis Gates, it's been quite the extremes. In year one, a surprisingly fun season where the Tigers make the second round of the NCAA basketball tournament, and they have the second best offense in basically a quarter century for Missouri. But the defense that first season left, well, a lot to be desired, especially statistically. But you know what? I made a lot of excuses, or perhaps reasons. That's the debate, right? Did Dennis Gates have excuses, or does he have reasons for why his defenses have not performed statistically at Missouri or at Cleveland State, for that matter? So here's the thing. There's been 28 years of KenPom data so far. How many times have the Tigers been worse, for example, in adjusted defense than Dennis Gates' 2 seasons of 180th and 181st overall? Well, honestly, just once. That'd be Quinn Snyder's last season in 2006, where the Tigers ranked 182nd, just one spot worse than Dennis Gates' last season. Then, of course, you can say, okay, well, how many were actually worse than 100th overall, again, in the last 28 seasons of Missouri basketball? Well, that'd be Konzo Martin's final season, where, again, like Quinn Snyder's final season, he was fired as Missouri's basketball coach. Kim Anderson's first 2 years were also worse than 100th nationally in adjusted defense. And, oh, yes, Frank Haith's final year at Missouri, where Mike Alden and the administration decided, we're not going to give you a contract extension. Good luck in Tulsa. And that's it, by the way. That's the entire list in the last 28 years, including the final 3 years of Norm Stewart's tenure, that Missouri has finished worse than 100th in defense. So generally speaking, when that happens, you get fired, or you have 2 of the worst seasons ever in the case of Kim Anderson. And by the way, before anybody points out tempo, by the way, oh, well, Dennis Gates' teams, well, they play just at lightning speed, right? Well, I would point out that Dennis Gates' teams haven't played nearly as fast as you might think they have. Even the first year, the team slowed down quite a bit after the warp speed non-conference schedule, where I think that was very experimental, and Gates was trying to figure out what exactly he wanted to do offensively. And speaking of offense, I have all the faith in the world that Dennis Gates can turn this team around offensively. I think they're going to figure out how to score points this season, being the 24-25 Tigers. But when it comes to defense, at a certain point, I need a little bit of proof of concept here. Now, back to the idea of excuses versus results. Again, I can make excuses and say, okay, Cleveland State, hey, that's Cleveland State, right? It's hard to compare results at Cleveland State to Missouri, right? Okay, it's harder to be in the top 100 at Cleveland State. Okay, again, fair enough. But I think I've given you some pretty good context. Again, these are tempo adjusted neutral numbers here. It's not about playing fast or slow. It's about giving up points per possession here. And Missouri's just been simply bad in Dennis Gates' first 2 years defensively here. Now, here's the thing. While the results have fallen off for Leonard Hamilton at Florida State, and of course I bring up Leonard Hamilton because he is Dennis Gates' mentor for all intents and purposes. And Leonard Hamilton, although the results have fallen off, not only in terms of wins and losses, but just defensively, the last 3 or 4 years post-pandemic here in this new world, the 70-plus-year-old Leonard Hamilton, the results have fallen off a little bit. To be brutally honest, but to be obvious, really, not even brutally honest, just to point out the obvious, Leonard Hamilton was an excellent defensive coach for most of his career. Again, just look at those same adjusted defensive numbers that I've shared with you today. So that means there's certainly hope for Dennis Gates. It's not as though him and Charlton Young, for example, haven't learned plenty for Leonard Hamilton. So here's the thing. I am willing, for as negative as maybe I've sounded in this particular segment so far, I really can chalk up the first year of Missouri and Dennis Gates being a pretty porous defensive team that relied, of course, on gambling for steals and turnovers. I can chalk that up to necessity. That was an undersized group, not only in the forward positions with Noah Carter and Kobe Brown essentially being your rim protectors for most of the year, but also, of course, Nick Honor is not the biggest guy in the world either. And we saw the problems with that, especially this past season. And as far as this second year as well, you know what? I'm going to give that one a slight mulligan. And maybe that's wishful thinking. Maybe it really is. But I just think, again, the first year where Dennis Gates is in high major basketball where he has to really, really rely on the NIL and transfer portal in such a big way, I don't know. But at the same time, even if I'm being generous and giving Dennis Gates a mulligan for year 3, I need to see some serious signs of defensive growth in year 3, or I'm just going to start believing that this is the normal for Dennis Gates, that this is the modus operandi, that this team is never going to be very good defensively. And the bottom line is, if you're not going to be very good defensively, well, you're going to have to be elite, like top 10, top 15 nationally every season if you're going to make the tournament. And that's a really high bar to clear. Just seems like Tigers got to figure out something on that end of the court, and I think some of it just comes down to, again, just not gambling as much, staying in your lane, stop over-helping. To me, that was my biggest bugaboo, especially from last season's Missouri basketball defense. Now, of course, we true sons and daughters are massive fans of Eli Drinkwitz at this point for obvious reasons. But the rest of the SEC, maybe not so much. And that's caused a common nickname to be floated out there. Of course, the bespectacled Eli Drinkwitz occasionally gets called Eli Dorkwitz. But instead of that being a pejorative, to me, Eli has taken that persona, owned it, and actually made it into a total positive for him. So I'm going to talk about that coming up here right after these quick words. So, of course, much of recruiting is basically being a salesman. And I'll tell you this, a lot of former Missouri players, at least a couple that I've talked to here recently, have described Eli Drinkwitz as a closer. And, well, as Alec Baldwin's character said in Glengarry Glen Ross, well, coffee is for closers. And Eli Drinkwitz, not a coffee guy, but a Diet Coke guy, I guess. But regardless, the point is here, Eli Drinkwitz, while does not have the dashing, piercing blue eyes and natural good looks and jawline and 6 foot tall plus frame of an Alec Baldwin, for example. No, he's He's a little bit different than that. And, well, frankly, he's a little bit of a dork. And I say that comfortably because Eli Drinkwitz has owned that. He's described himself. He's a self-described short, dorky white guy. I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but something similar. He's described him to that as himself before. So in a weird way, it's almost like he deflects and diffuses any idea that he doesn't look like a football player or a football coach, of course, more importantly, because, well, Eli Drinkwitz didn't play football in the SEC, of course, or any Division I level. And again, he's made fun of his own lack of ability at football in the past. But I really think there is a method to Eli Drinkwitz's madness here, whether he realizes it or not. Maybe this is just completely 100% authentically him. But I got to say, I do think Eli has a little bit of salesman in him, and I think the best persona that he can put out there to sell himself is to be exactly who he is, because it comes off as authentic right now. It just does. And all of us are acting to some extent, and I've thought many times about, Eli Drinkwitz. I feel like I'm a pretty successful guy in my own right, and then I think, oh, wait, Eli Drinkwitz is a few months younger than me, actually, and oh, wait, there are levels to this. That's for darn sure. But the thing I think that Eli Drinkwitz and I have in common is that I described myself recently in a piece in Como magazine and the Columbia Business Times. Thanks again to Ryan Sheehan and everybody over there for creating a nice piece about me in this podcast. But I described myself in that piece as an affable weirdo. And I think that part of the success of this podcast, to whatever extent it's successful, is that I'm willing to, get into the weird parts and be a nerd, get into a dark room, figuratively and literally speaking sometimes, and get into the details, get into all the weirdness and figure stuff out. But at the same time, I'm a weirdo, I'm a nerd, but I'm affable enough that people like me. At least enough people do. Maybe that's the secret sauce to this program. Well, I think there's some truth to that with Eli Drinkwitz as well, a guy who is obsessive enough to spend hours and hours doing things that most people don't want to do, whether it's looking at film offensively, and more likely with Kirby Moore on staff these days, talking to a lot of high schoolers and their parents, and, glad handing the media and alums and donors and doing all kinds of stuff that frankly takes you away from the actual nuts and bolts of football, which is something that I'm sure that Eli Drinkwitz loves to dip his toes into. In fact, I promise you he does. There's a reason he held on to the offensive coordinator play calling duties despite having all of his head coaching duties. He loves the detailed, nerdy part of football, and yet I think what we found is that Eli Drinkwitz, a little bit like myself, but again, there are levels to this stuff. He's way above me. He's an affable weirdo as well, a guy who can relate to all kinds of people, a guy who can relate to the guys in the film room, the guys who are the stat sheet people who are trying to figure out, just based on data, what the best call is on 3rd and 5. And yes, guys like absolute alpha male personalities like Luther Burden and Christian Williams and Johnny Walker and Brady Cook and everybody else in the Tiger locker room. So to me, I think that's part of Eli Drinkwitz in his secret sauce, is the fact that he's able to live in both worlds. He's able to live in the world of the dorks and relate to them. And he's also able to live in the world of the alpha male football players as well and fire him up and say stuff like Mizzou is about that action and get all of us excited too. And speaking of excited, I don't know about you, I'm pretty excited for some Missouri football. We're just over 3 weeks away from kickoff, and you know what? I'm going to be here with you 5 days a week until kickoff starts, during the season as well. I absolutely cannot wait. So until next time, I am John Miller, and thanks as always for listening to Locked on Mizzou.